All right, so welcome to our second workshop discussion lecture series hosted by Maritime School of Swords Terra Nova. My name is Phil Swift. I have here Patrick. He is our longsword fencer student at their school, and he'll be monitoring the chats as well. So we have a really cool guest who is also a friend of mine. His name is Justin Aucoin. AKA Master Remy, super duper famous in the East Coast, in the East Kingdom. He's been fencing since 2006, has over 10 years experience in Italian rapier, works with, he uses the works of Capoferro, Giganti, Fabris, and he's been recently studying Alfieri, sorry. As as a competitor, he's represented the East Coast in pretty much every single kind of rapier championship title you can imagine. He is also the former general of the East Kingdom Rapier Army, which is pretty much like brings in, I want to say, 500 to 1,000 rapier fencers at Pennsic.
About 500, yeah.
Yeah, 500, yeah. He's also a member of the SCA's Order of Defense. Outside of the SCA, he is the founder of Boston Academy d'Armes, the Armes, and also teaches rapier at Athena School of Arms. When I was in the SCA in the Midwest, everyone knows of the name Master Remy. I've never seen him before, but I've heard of his name before even seeing him. And it was like, if you're on the war field and you see Remy and his crew, if you can't fight them, you better like run in a sense. So, yes, he's here today to talk about fighting against different body types, against different personalities, or fencing type personalities as well. Justin, I'm going to leave it up to you.
All right, so let me share my screen here. All right, can everyone see my lovely Google slides here? Cool. So tonight we're going to be talking about picking an assault with someone not your own size. So we're going to be specifically looking at tactics for facing someone who's taller than you, shorter, stronger, or weaker. Something to kind of keep in mind, these are all relative, right? As someone who's 5'6", I am typically a shorter fencer, but once in a great while, I fight someone who's shorter than me, and it's fantastic. Meanwhile, like if you're average height, you probably sometimes are a taller fencer, sometimes you're a shorter fencer. If you're a tall fencer, like if you're like 6'5", 6'6", you're probably not very often the shorter. So this is all kind of relative between you and your opponent, and not like absolutes. Let's see. A little bit about me, Phil talked a lot about it, so we can kind of skip this. Study a lot of Northern Italian and French school of fencing and kind of seeing the crossovers between there, especially as like the rapier turns into the small sword and all that good stuff. My school, Boston Academy of Arms, is as a hybrid school, so we teach in person and still online. We're more than happy to have drop-ins, so if you ever like, hey, I want to do some solo Italian rapier drills and stuff, you're more than welcome to join my class on Monday nights, and I'll drop links so you can kind of get that info if that's of interest later. So in the 17th century, we start to see the Italian fencing masters not just talking about techniques or mechanics of how to defeat your opponent, but also the tactics for defeating them as well. So in 3 books, we really kind of see this pop up. Salvador Fabris in 1606, Alfieri in 1640, and then Marcelli in 1686 all talk about fighting these different types of opponents depending on their height, the strength, or their temperament, or like basically their fencing personality, as it were. Marcelli is Southern Italian, so his style of fencing is a little bit different than Alfieri and Fabris, which is Northern Italian, but there is a lot of overlap in terms of tactics and stuff like that. This is a great quote from Alfieri. This is why I told Phil that if you're doing this as a drinking game, you're going to be drunk very quickly. I love this quote from Alfieri in which he talks about why tactics aren't a one-size-fit-all kind of idea. He says, if we conduct our attacks against these opponents in the same manner without distinction, then we give clear notice of having little knowledge of even an experienced fencing and we'll only learn from the hurt our enemies inflict. So basically, if you try to fight every opponent the exact same way, you're going to get hit. And the only way you're going to learn is by getting hit. So we're going to kind of talk about approaches so we can approach different opponents different ways so we don't learn by getting punked too often, hopefully. Even though losing is part of the learning experience, we'll pretend this is a tournament where we got our big duel coming up and we don't want to get hit at all. So it's kind of things to think about while we're going through this presentation. First of all is, how do you fit in these categories? Are you typically a tall fighter or a short fighter? Are you typically strong or weak? Kind of figure out, it's good to know what your own strengths and weaknesses might be based on these genetic differences, as well as think about like how can you exploit these strengths and weaknesses of your opponent. If you're fighting a taller opponent, what are they more likely to try to do to you? So you try to stay away from that. And how are they weak? Where are their weaknesses that you can basically try to exploit? So it's good to kind of look at from both sides here, both in terms of yourself as a fighter, but also how you might approach your opponents. So again, we're going over tall and short offenses, strong and weaker. The masters also talk about the 4 temperaments, which is basically timid, reckless, choleric, and phlegmatic. We're not going to cover that tonight. I've done that as previous presentations. So if that interests folks, I'll drop the link and you can kind of watch that on your own time and stuff. It's really kind of cool, interesting stuff. All right, we're going to kick it off with approaching the tall fencer. So again, this is all relative based on you and your opponent. So you walk into your list, and now you realize your opponent is taller than you. So the advantages of being tall is that you can deliver a long lunge. You can strike from really far away. You can keep opponents at bay just by extending your arm, right? If I'm fighting someone who's taller than me, if they just reach out, they point at me, I need to deal with that because it's almost like that cartoon gimmick of when like the tall fighter has got his hand on the short guy's forehead and the short guy is kind of just wailing around. It's kind of that's the same idea by just the tall fighter extending this sword. The short guy needs to deal with it somehow, or the short fencer needs to deal with it somehow. The tall fencer can strike first and attack a short fencer with a hail of blows, while the short fencer is out his measure. So basically, tall fencer can throw a lot of shots before the short fencer can even get close to being able to throw a shot. So that's a big advantage for a tall fencer. In both Fabris and Alfieri say that tall fencers don't need to gain an opponent's sword or, quote, observe too many precautions, but they won't blame you if you do. So basically, like if you're doing good Italian techniques, you're trying to control your opponent's weapon, control the line, make them throw an attack in a tempo that you can strike them in. But if you really are much taller than your opponent, you can kind of forego some of that stuff because you're so tall, you can just reach out and touch them from much further away. But at the same time, they still think it's a good idea to use all that good mechanics. Some disadvantages: larger target area, right? If I'm 5'6" and my opponent's 6'6", there's just more mass to them, ideally, just by being that much taller, so they have a big more target for me to hit, even though some of it might be kind of hard for me to reach. Fabris and Alfieri say that taller fencers are slower by the great weight of body and limbs. I think they're kind of working on like this very extreme, like almost like caricature in some ways there. And we all know plenty of tall fencers who are extremely fast, right? So I kind of disagree with them on this, but I kind of get where they're going with in terms of right, more mass, they must be slower. But that's not really the case. One thing that I think we see a lot with tall fencers, they tend to rely on the genetics over techniques. So basically, if you see, especially early on, new fencers who are tall will just use their reach to win fights, right? And not really worrying about good mechanics, good blade mechanics, good attacks and tempos, or any setup plays. They're just using their reach to hit their opponent. Which, as Fabris and Alfieri say, this is fine if you're fighting a duel. You can totally do this and it's legit and stuff. But I think if we look at this from an SCA rapier or Hemer perspective, in terms of this is being a kind of a sport, you'll see a higher trajectory of tall new fencers sooner. But if they're not learning technique to kind of back it up, they're going to hit a wall at some point and get easily frustrated. So as coaches, that's something to kind of keep in mind as well. If you have really tall new fencers that are doing really well, make sure they're getting in some good techniques and stuff because they're going to hit a wall at some point. All right, how to defeat the taller opponent? One, for the love of God, start out of their measure. Don't start in measure because you're going to be in their measure before you're in your own measure. So start from well out of measure. Make sure your swords are not even close to being crossed, so you have some time to kind of gauge what's happening here. You got to seek control over the sword, right? They can just hit you from a mile away. If you just step in without trying to control their sword or the line of attack, they're going to punk you in the face real easily. So you need to have good blade control and control that line of attack at all times. Only move forward after controlling their sword or the line of attack. Again, if you don't have control of it, they have control of your weapon. You step forward, you're just asking to get hit. Steal measure as they approach forward. So as a tall fencer stepping forward, you can also step forward at the same time while controlling their sword. And now you've basically stolen a bunch of measure from them. So they think they're going to be maybe in laga or their lager. Instead, you step into your own laga. So you basically get a little bit closer than they're expecting, which is great for you because now maybe you can strike them. But also sometimes opponents will kind of like it takes a second for them to realize what happened, and they're going to be a beat behind, just mentally processing the fact that you're much closer to them than they were expecting. Strike on the pass or gaining on the lunge, and we'll look at what gaining on the lunge is, but it's one of my favorite techniques for striking people that are much taller than I am. Try to get them Missouri straight if you can. So if they do try to run away, they're stepping back into your lunge distance, so you can do your step lunge and still strike them. They can't step away out of your measure. Use transports to open high lines or access low lines safely. That's a big one. Tall fencers like to keep their sword high a lot of times, or it's high enough that it's not easy for us to strike the high line if we're shorter than them. So we'll look at that as well. And low line attacks and voids, right? If you're short, use your shortness to your advantage by just staying super low, getting underneath their sword and weapon, and striking them with some cool low line voids. And don't be afraid to strike and Dewey Tempe, right? They're going to throw a lot of shots at you, so you can make sure you get that parry and riposte. So basically, you got to master your art if you want to defeat someone who's much taller than you. All right, so this is the gaining step or gaining on the lunge. Latouche, who's actually a French master, is a big fan of this one. It's basically bringing your back foot closer to your front foot. So instead of taking it advanced where it's front foot and back foot, you would bring the back foot towards the front foot. And what that does is it gives you about an extra foot or two worth of distance on your lunge. So if you see here, this is my normal stance. This is my stance if I've done my gaining step. And then you can see how much more reach I have here on my gaining on the lunge versus my normal lunge. So my front foot started exactly the same spot, but I gained several inches. And what I like about this gaining step too is that it's very subtle, moving that back foot because it's kind of hidden by a lot of your body. And if you kind of do any blade work, it really kind of masks what the fact that your back foot is doing something. It's very easy for your opponent not to realize that you just stole about 6 inches or a foot of measure on them. So they think you're further away than you actually are. Arik, who presented last week, had a good quote on this kind of idea. He likes to kind of describe, and I'm not sure if he's in the chat or if he watches this later. So I apologize if I missummarize his idea here, but he likes to describe your offensive measure as based on where your back foot is. So if your back foot is really far away from your opponent, you're not going to reach as easily as compared to if it's close, like on this gaining step. The downside or the caveat to the gaining step here is that if you have already a narrow stance, bring that back foot an extra few inches isn't going to make a huge difference to your lunge, right? You only make up whatever distance that back foot carries. So if it only goes a few inches, that's all you're going to get on your gaining on the lunge, which maybe that's all you need. Maybe all you need is those extra 3 inches, and fantastic. But for me, because I have a little bit of a wider stance, I gain a good foot on my lunge and stuff, and that's going to really throw people off. All right, transports. This is also one of my favorite things to do, especially against Phil's buddy Doug or DeRoger in the SCA. He is like 6'5". I don't know. He's really tall. He's at my local practice and he fights Destreza. So he's tall dude, likes to keep that right angle of the sword. I can't hit him on the high line because his high line is like a mile high above me. So I can't hit him in the high line, but if I just to go attack him on his low line, he can just hit me in the face because it's so much further away. So the transports allows us to control our opponent's weapon while accessing the low line. So we're going to just watch this. This is some video of some of my newer fencers from over the summer in the class. So there's work that transport. So they're finding here on the inside line. transporting their opponent's weapon from that high inside to their low outside, and then striking. And you can do this with a lunge, or you see Aneshka there did it with the pass. I like doing it with the pass because I can really get past my opponent's point to strike. In case something goes wrong, I control my opponent's weapon and a whole bunch of stuff. So transport's another great technique for against taller fencers. And last but not least, we're going to look at low-line voids. So if your opponent's like that much above you, just use your shortness to your advantage by getting really low. So this is a clip from a fight from one of my students in the SCA. He's fighting sword and dagger. I just got my single rapier here, so this is my little humble brag moment of the presentation. I step in just enough to basically extend my arm just to get a feint. So he throws a shot at my head, which is the right idea because that's the closest target to him. And I just do this nice low line void with the pass and striking him underneath his weapon. And then literally I just kind of like walk off the field because it was just a really cool hit. So if you're already much shorter than your opponent, using that shortness to your advantage can be super useful as well. But you got to make sure you have the right tempo. If he's standing still and not throwing an attack or something at me, he can parry that very easily and make me look kind of foolish. So make sure that they're really committed to their attack before you do something like that. All right, now we're going to look on the other side of this coin, how to approach and fight the short fencer. So some advantages of being short. There are advantages. One, you have a smaller target area. So like, especially if you stay nice in profile, there's just not as much of you compared to a tall fencer for them to hit. Again, this is kind of all relative, so like that difference might not be very much, and this does not take into account weight or anything like that. So just also kind of keep in mind. Easier to cover themselves behind their guard. Again, if you're relatively small and you stay nice in profile, turn your hand over, nice and easy, can cover your body much easier. Quicker, smaller defensive actions. Again, the idea here from the masses is saying they're smaller, less mass, therefore easier to just cover your body for defense. And once you get past your opponent's point, you have a bigger safe zone. It's a lot harder for your opponent the taller fencer here, to get their point back online to be able to thrust at you and stuff. And this also plays a bigger role in like the SCA rapier, where like cuts aren't as big of a thing. So really thrust-centric kind of rule sets, this kind of plays a bigger role in. Disadvantages, they gotta get past the taller fencer's point, right? We just kind of looked at that. So there's a lot of opportunities to strike them while they're approaching. Some techniques or ideas for approaching and defeating your shorter opponent. Stay on the offensive, right? Make sure you're throwing a lot of shots at them. They gotta get past your point to be able to strike you. That means they gotta step forward at some point, even though there are some very defensive short fencers. So you can use that to your advantage as they step forward. Throw shots, make them feel uncomfortable, really make them think twice about trying to step past your point. Try to make them overcommit on getting past your point and make a mistake. Strike in prima tempo, again, we're going to look at that one. If they start to get close, retreat. Don't be afraid to run away here. Give ground, especially if you have ground. This kind of also depends on the list. Sometimes we fight in really small lists. In HEMA and the SCA, sometimes in the SCA, you get to fight in this giant field and you can just basically back up forever. I have tall fencer friends that love to do that against me, and it's a pain in the ass. So if you find yourself in that kind of way, taking retreating steps so you're always in your measure and your opponent's never in your measure is never a bad idea. Feint and strike, again, this is all about putting your opponent on the defensive, making them feel uncomfortable while trying to approach you. All right, so we're actually going to take look at a clip from modern foil fencing, which I get is a different game than what we play, but there's still some crossover in terms of techniques that can be used or tactics and stuff. So we're going to look at a short clip of Kasara, who's 6'4", fighting Claybrink, who's 5'9". So this is kind of back. So to me, 5'9" is tall. That's an average size American male, but that is tall in my world at 5'6". But he's fighting someone who's got a good like 5-6 inches on them and stuff. So now Clybrink is now in a position where he's the short fencer fighting someone's tall. We're going to see how Kasara is dealing with that. He's basically going to be doing it by throwing a lot of feints, taking retreat steps, and making his opponent overcommit. So Kasara says on the left, he's just, again, the points in the face, really making Clybrink think twice about taking those steps in. Feints, lots of strides, and then he gets Clybrink there to charge really fast, kind of be reckless, charge in really hard, and making him pay by retreating, parrying, and riposte. We'll just look at one more time. And he almost got him on that one too. So again, great use of Casara knows what his range is. He knew exactly where he needed to be, and he knew how to draw a Clybrink into overcommitting and give him a nice big tempo to strike in. So we're going to talk about striking in prima tempo. So we're going to be looking at a drill that I ran with my Intro to Italian Rapier students over the summer. So these are all brand new fencers. So we weren't working on this this play as a tactic as tall versus short. We're just kind of looking at it as a really good tempo to strike your opponent in. But basically, if your short opponent is trying to find your blade as they step forward, you're going to want to disengage in that tempo and strike them on that step. So we're just going to look at this. So again, you can see the wall side here is trying to find the camera side sword, and then the wall side is just disengaging to the opposite line and striking. And ideally, they want to be hitting that student or their partner here as they're taking that step, because while they're taking that step forward, they can't move in any other direction. They can't move until that foot lands. Obviously, these are brand new fences, so we're really nice and playing it lax with tempo. But it also makes it nice and easy to see what the basic technique is and stuff. But ideally, you want to hit them while they're taking that step, which happens actually a lot, short fencers, because they know they need to cover a lot of ground, and they know that they need to control your weapon, will take a really big step, advancing step, while trying to find your sword. And if they do that, they're giving you a huge tempo to disengage and strike them in. So if you find someone much shorter than you who's being very aggressive as they approach you, look for that opportunity. All right, now we're going to look at stronger versus weaker. I think this specifically, when we look at what Alfieri and Fabris are talking about, they're really kind of going to almost like some ideal extremes here. So we'll talk about that, but we'll also talk about some more realistic strength differences and how that might play out on the list and stuff as well. So some advantages of being strong: you can dominate your opponent's sword easier, right? Get control of their opponent's sword. You can push them around. You can dominate their sword. You can basically do whatever you want to them. You save it from riposte and single tempo actions. So if your opponent tries to strike you, either like in just like while you're already at rest, kind of waiting for them, or if they set you up for a nice counterattack, counter tempo action, it's going to be very hard for them to strike through a strong opponent's sword, because that stronger opponent can just deviate their sword, even if the weaker opponent has pretty good blade mechanics, depending on the strength differences. This is where relative strength differences really kind of varies a lot. Some disadvantages, according to Alfieri and Fabris, none. They say, quote, they are naturally superior, unquote, all things considered equal. So, hit the gym, do those deadlifts, do your complex lifts, pull-ups, bench presses, get swole as hell. Fabris and Alfieri think you cannot lose. In actuality, some people who are very strong, kind of like people who are very tall, will overuse their strength. They'll just fight. The whole fight tactic or strategy is based on being strong. So they'll be very pushy on their opponent's blade, and they might not really use good blade geometry to do it. They just might use pure brute strength, and we can kind of find some ways of exploiting that if that's the type of strength that our opponent is trying to utilize against us. So how to defeat the stronger opponent? Cover yourself behind your sword. So again, this is all about just having a good guard, find your opponent's, making sure that your sword is between your opponent's blade and your body. Use the dexterity of the hand. So basically keep your blade free. So lots of disengages. So you want to do cavaciones, contra cavaciones, recavaciones. For folks who aren't Italian fences out there, that's a disengage, a counter disengage, or a counter to the counter disengage. So basically we're disengaging all day, right? Your opponent because they're strong, right? If they try to find your blade and press on it, just disengage to the opposite line. So you're going to be moving your sword a lot so they can't get control over your weapon. You can also use the mezzocavaciones. That's a half disengage. So usually you would see it like bringing your sword from the high line to the low line below their hilts to be able to strike them in those tempos. Keep your opponent at the point of your sword. They got to deal with your sword. So when you disengage, make sure that you're disengaging it with a threat and not just disengaging just to like keep your blade free. There needs to be a threat behind there, or they're just going to charge you down. Try not to parry in single tempi, because that again, your opponent's stronger than you. They're going to be able to push. They could probably blow through your like contra tempo or your counter attack actions a little bit easier. But look for use voids, do retreats, do sidestep evasions, giradas. That's the really cool, or like the French would call the volta. That's the really cool where you kind of like step your back foot steps behind your lead foot, and you kind of get the cool pose and stuff that you see in like Fabris and Capoferro. Those look great. Striking around their sword. So again, I couldn't find a good photo or video of this, but I'll show a demonstration with some pens or letter openers to kind of demonstrate the idea. So let me just actually shut down this shared screen. Stop sharing here so I can show people here. So if I attack my opponent here on their inside lines, I'm aiming for their chest and they parry. So normally I have my true edge, which is the knuckle side of my sword facing their blade, but they're really pushing me offline. Instead of trying to stay with that true edge, I can turn my hand over and use the false edge. So normally this is quarter that I would use to attack on the inside line. If they're being really pushy on their parry, I can turn my hand into secunda, so that's false edge, and strike around their weapon, usually doing that with a passing step to get past their point, or a passata sotto, basically a low line void pass. That's one of my favorite things to do against people who are just very pushy on the sword, because visually they think they still have control over your weapon. So they see this and they don't notice that you turn your sword over. So they think visually that they have control over your weapon. And also tactically, they also feel that they have control over your weapon. Strong fighters, especially if they use strength to fight with, want to feel that blade contact a lot of times. So they get that tactical feel that they still have your control of your weapon. But that false edge really lets you kind of shoot around their blade nice and easily. Let me get back into my screen share. Cool. And last thing, try not to get too close to strong fighters. This really depends on your rule set, but assuming that this was a duel, if your opponent's much stronger than you, come to grips. You don't want to get into a wrestling match with them. If they're really outstrength you and if you're not an amazing technical wrestler, it's probably going to be a bad time for you and stuff. In the SCA Rapier, unless we have specifically wrestling or grappling rules involved, we don't need to worry about that too much. Like, we can kind of get around this idea. But if we're thinking about approaching our fights as this is life or death, maybe getting too close to Hercules here is not a great idea. All right, so now we're going to look at using the Recavicione to defeat the Contra Cavicione. So again, Cavicione is your disengage. You can defeat the disengage with your own disengage, or a counter disengage, which is what the Contra Cavicione is. And you can beat the counter to that counter with your own second disengage, which is a Recavicione. So you're basically just disengaging all night and day. So again, these are some newer fencers, which means their blade actions will be moving at a good speed that you can kind of take an idea with and be able to follow. And ideally, this fencer on the left would maybe be throwing an attack on their disengage. It wouldn't necessarily just be standing still. But sometimes we like to practice this with our opponent or partner, just kind of standing very still, just to kind of really focus on the blade actions first, and less the timing of it. Did you see the fences here on the right is finding the blade, is freeing their blade. Fence on the left is trying to refind it, so the fencer on the far side disengages a second time to strike. This is from a different angle. Now they've swapped roles, so now the fencer on the left is doing the Recavicione. So yeah, this is all about just like someone's trying to find your sword, keeping it free, being very dexterous. Think about being like really kind of more flowy. So really kind of think about being very fluid in your fighting and less so if we kind of like if you think about Avatar, Last Airbender, try to be more water and air in your fighting and less earth. Don't be like, that strong fighter is going to be a little bit more earth-like in holding their ground or holding that blade position. Here's another way you can defeat a stronger fencer here, and this is basically using an indirect riposte or riposte via Cavicione. So in this case, the weaker fencer is throwing a shot. It's sorry, the stronger fencer's thrown a shot. It's been parried by the weaker fencer with the Dewey Tempe. As they start to extend their sword, the stronger fencer is trying to counter parry it, and we're just going to now disengage to that open line to strike. So this is going to be walked through nice and slow. There's the parry. As I recover here, I'm pushing very hard on Aneshka's blade, so she just disengages to the opposite line to strike. And she's doing this all in good tempo. So as I'm taking that retreating step back, she's got a nice opportunity for where she can disengage around my weapon to strike. As you can see, I'm kind of parrying back with a very strong angle on my blade. That's another way you might see this idea of strength being played out. By angling your sword, it's easy to get your forte sometimes on your opponent's weapon. So sometimes people just keep their point way too high when they're parrying, and making it easy to kind of disengage around their blade and stuff as well. And if you're finding that trying to strike your opponent is just really hard, either regardless if it's a tall fighter or a strong fighter, you don't always need to go for the body. We don't always need to go for the kill shots, the head or the body. Sometimes we can hit the forearm or the hand, that advanced target. Go for something that's not as a committed of an attack, that's still going to do some damage, right? I would not want a sword striking my hand or going through my wrist and forehand if these were sharp and this was a duel and stuff. So just another thing to kind of keep in mind is these fights don't always need to be about body shots. We can also think about throwing shots at the hand. The one thing here is you throw that shot, you want to retreat out of measure. You don't want to, if you miss that shot, fish around and like start doing like saw cutting, trying to get anything, because you're giving your opponent your debile at that point. So you really want to make sure that like you land that shot or not, you throw it and you get out of dodge and reset. All right, now we're going to look on how to defeat the weaker fencer. The advantages, according to Fabris and Alfieri, is none. They didn't use a sad face, but I'm sure if they had emojis back then, they might have thrown one in there. Some disadvantages, we've already kind of been over that. It's harder to gain the opponent's sword if they're much stronger than you. It's harder to strike through your opponent's sword because they're stronger than you. And you have to strike with the sword. You can't really use wrestling to win those fights just because your opponent just has that much more strength to kind of overpower you. So how to defeat the weaker fighter? Subjugate their sword. So basically find, gain, and strike, that basic blade control, regardless of what system you fight with. There's always some form of controlling the opponent's sword or controlling their line of attack. Once you get control of it, strike them if they try to disengage and hit you on the opposite line in contra tempo. If they don't do anything, because you have the control of their weapon, you have control over the line, you're stronger than them, you can just extend your sword and lunge and hit them. Pursue the opponent. They try to run away, but be cautious about it. You don't want to overcommit or be reckless. And if you do get to grapples with your opponent, you can throw them to the ground, you can disarm them, but make sure they only have the one weapon. They got a dagger, trying to come to the grips or get into that wrestling match is much more dicey because they can shank you, right? So you got to make sure that this is really kind of talking about single rapier, and not if they have, like, even if I have a buckler and this is a life or death fight, if someone steps in that close to me, I'm going to punch them in the face with the shield. I'm going to go Captain America for a second and just going to hit them in the face, bloody the nose, maybe give them concussion, and have a lot of tempos or be able to walk away at least at that point. So you got to really make sure that you know what you're doing if you get in that close. All right, so now we're going to play, a little game here, in which we're going to talk about a type of fencer that we probably have all run into, that is not covered by Fabris Alfieri, and that is a fast fencer. So I'm going to actually, this is going to be a little interactive bit, so congrats everyone, didn't realize they were getting pulled in for this part. But what do we think some advantages are of a fast fencer? I took my own notes in case we kind of run out of ideas, but I'm going to open it to the floor and I'm going to keep track of what we come up with. So what's some ideas here? Easy to hits on slow pokes. Okay, yep. They can throw shots faster. What else we got? Efficient fences. Yeah, if we're thinking about speed in terms of as efficiency, yeah, that can be. Yep. So there are a couple of quotes that went through. Let me just bring that back up. Yep. Some other ones I have is quicker footwork, right? They can just move faster. So like you think you have them and then they move really fast out of measure, or they can move into measure. So they can move in and out of measure much faster. They can be a lot more cagey that wise. Faster to recover from the lunge. Right, so speed is a big thing. Latouche, again, he's a French fencing master from the 1670s. He talks about speed or velocity as an advantage that you can actually use and exploit. Yep, they might be able to retreat faster than you can advance. Yep, that goes down to like quicker footwork. I should probably finish that sentence there. Last stitch, oh shit, you can save them. Yep, yep. Especially if they do that with the retreat again. They're really quick hands, quick feet. It's really hard to like be able to defeat someone that can move very quickly. So I think that's a lot of. I think we hit a lot of the main points here. What are some disadvantages? You're fighting the Flash. What's the disadvantage that the Flash has? Or maybe not him specifically, but a fast fighter. Might overreact, yeah. Overcommitted, I think is how I described it in my notes. That's a good one. I think it's also really, I wrote down trigger happy, right? They might just kind of like, you move, they just move really fast as well. Impatient, yep. Easily goaded, yep. Yeah, so especially if you're fighting someone who is fighting based on speed alone, kind of like if someone's fighting based on strength alone or fighting based on their height alone. So they're basically fighting based on just their genetics here. Yeah, it's very easy for them to fall into these traps or overuse it too much and stuff. Um, so I used to fall into this trap when I was brand new. I didn't really have good blade techniques. I was just fast. I was 5'6" and like 130 pounds. So like I didn't have a lot of mass to me and I can move in and out really fast. One of the problems I had is that I could get my opponent to give me a tempo, but I would move too fast. So I would lunge in the middle of their disengage without them finishing their disengage. So I basically impaled myself onto their sword because their sword point is below my hilt and not to the line that I'm expecting it to be on. So they can basically move too fast and attack out of tempo. So basically, if you're a very fast fencer, you want to attack in tempo of your opponent's movement, not necessarily at the speed of light. If you're tall and fast, again, you can kind of get away with just going at pure light speed. But if you don't outreach your opponent, if you're the same height or shorter, you need to make sure you're moving specifically in tempo and not too fast. All right, so if we're coming up with some ideas of how we can defeat our fast opponent here, what do we got? What are some ideas of, how do you approach someone who you know is much faster than you? Patience, choose your shots. Yep, that's a good one. Feint, yep, that goes back into them being trigger happy. If you feint, they might be able to basically give you a tempo. Invitations, yeah, perfect. Yeah, distance. Be closer than you appear. Right, because if you start to throw your shot and they do their quick retreat, if you're closer than they think, you can still strike them. I think that might come back to you that gaining on the lunge, so you can kind of steal some measure from them, so they don't realize that you've taken 6 inches of measure from them. So when you throw their lunge, they start to retreat on their parry, but instead of falling short, you strike them still in the chest. Yep, that's a great one. What else do I have? I got there. I wrote down keep your defense tight. Stay profile as you can. So just make yourself a small target. Strike in contra tempo. So basically force them to have to attack you on an open line and strike them in that tempo. So basically find ways of making so here's an idea. Find ways of making their attacks slower. They're a fast attacker. We need to find some ways of doing that. We can do that by angulating our blade. So basically, we raise our point a little bit while raising our hilt. So they got to disengage around more vertical aspects of our sword. Actually, let me get out of the screen share so I can demonstrate some of this stuff. So, fast fighter. This is our fast fighter. This is us. So we have them found here. If we just find them like this, it's very easy for them to do these small, quick disengages, right? But we can angulate our blade by basically dropping our hilt a little bit and keeping our tip just a little bit high. So now they need to disengage around more of our sword. So it's a larger proportion of movement, which makes them slower. That's one way we can basically make a fast opponent slower. It's going to frustrate the heck out of them. We can gain more of their sword, so we just get more penetration. So get further down their sword, still stay in their weak, the double, the foible, or whatever your system calls are the weak of their sword. Again, that makes it bigger disengage, and a bigger disengage is going to be slower just because it's a bigger action. Or we can have more breadth, and that's more horizontal or lateral distance between the swords. So again, if this is our fast fighter and this is us, as we fight them, instead of having our blades super close, we can have a few inches of distance laterally, so left and right between the weapons. So if our opponent tries to disengage, they got to cross all the way over there to try to get to the open line, which gives us more time or tempo to react to their attacks and stuff. So that's what I mean by angulation, breadth, and penetration and stuff like that. So I think we've covered that. So that's just a fun little game. So anytime you can basically do this with any type of fighter based on genetics or based on what their temperament or fighter personality is like, and kind of like think about what's their advantages, what are their disadvantages, and based on those two things, come up with your own strategy and tactics for defeating them. So let's see. I think so. That is it. So now we can go into the Q&A portion. And I'm going to drop in the chat while people do that some links to both my school, but also to some other videos that folks might find interesting and stuff too, where I talk about the 4 temperaments of fighting.
All right, so does anyone have any questions for Justin? He covered a lot of really good tips there. Does anyone want to discuss anything that he covered or has any questions about it? Now would be your time to ask. So when have you met a tall, fast fencer before?
Oh yeah, we have a bunch of them. Like I feel like Donovan, who's in my local practice, is tall and fast.
Yeah,
He's like
so
he's over 6 feet, and he does Fabris, so he's like all his main target is his head, but his head is like hidden behind his hilt, and it's above where I can easily hit. So that makes it really difficult, right? Kind of, yeah, when you start combining one or two of these things, man, that's when you got to
what's
get
your
really creative.
strategy against Donovan since he's probably not here? So
Yeah, I mean, he probably knows what I like. He probably knows what I try to. So I try to do transports, but he's expecting that, right? Because he was one of my main training partners, so he knows what I want to do with him. So I start transports, but I got to be ready for him to do his disengage and try to attack me in the open line. So a lot of try to do is just get him to overcommit. I'll do feints, play around with distance, do some footwork to make him think that I'm getting right on the cusp of his lunge range, and then retreat away. So he lunges. He's in his lunge position, which is a very vulnerable spot to be in as a fencer. Control the sword, and then use my own speed and blade techniques to either run him down real quickly or at least press my advantage on him. So yeah, that's how I would. That's how I like. When in doubt, try to get your opponent to like lunge at you and then control their weapon and hit them. Draw them out into a spot where they're weak, especially if they're doing a weird guard. If you fight someone who's doing a guard you've never seen before, do some weird shit to try to get them out of that into a position that you're more comfortable in. Yeah. Someone's doing like the weird Fabrisy things and stuff. Just not like being cagey, start throwing some feints, get them to like extend their sword or get them into a position where you're more comfortable, and then you'll find more success. But if you try to fight them on their own turf like that, it's going to be much, much more difficult.
Okay, so I have a question. I used to from Andre. I used to practice using different sizes of swords, or even fighting against spear with rapier. Hold on, I just said rapier. Do you think it'd be kind of good training? Do you think do you think it to be a kind of good training if you don't find taller people in your area? So basically, if you can't find taller people, what's a way to train against fighting or fencing?
Yeah, I guess you. Yeah, so like sometimes I'll give like a if you have a longer sword, like I don't. I personally I fight with like a 39, 40-inch blade, because for me if I can't draw it out of a sheath or scabbard, it's not going to do me any good. So I kind of think, well, like if this is my self-defense weapon in the street, if I can't get it out in time to protect myself, it's too long. So I use a shorter blade myself. So like, but like if I want to practice with someone who's taller, giving them a longer blade, like a 45-inch, can kind of mimic that distance that I need to cover. That's not a bad idea. Yeah, if you have a really short spear, like a like a really short spear, because spears are like 6 feet at least, right? So like that's maybe way extreme. But yeah, finding some longer blades like that can be good. Sometimes I'll have my students when they're in the coach's role kind of stand up in that tall Destrezza Diestro like pose. So they get that max reach of their own height by standing very tall, max reach at that 90 degrees at that shoulder to really like give the student a lot of more difficulties access and high lines. That's another way that I will kind of like simulate tall fencers.
Okay, there's another question. Do you have a strong opinion for the ideal blade length for someone depending on their stature? To what extent is it viable for a shorter fencer to compensate with a longer blade?
Yeah, so like I said, for me, I like using a shorter blade because my whole thing is if I can't use this for self-defense in the streets, then like it's too long for me. And again, I primarily play in the SCA rapier, so I like to think about this from the really historical perspective of I'm walking down the streets, me and my buddy, and maybe some drunkards roll out, say something mean about Phil's bandana, and now we got to throw down with them. So I need to make sure I can like draw my sword and stuff. So I like to use a weapon that I feel like I can wield based on my own height. So I use shorter. I know some short fencers that try to make up their lack of reach with longer swords. If you can, if you can use good body mechanics and good technique, I think it's okay. What I sometimes see is that people will use a sword that's really long and maybe too heavy for them. And what's happened is I've seen fencers who do that, and if they're not using good body mechanics, if they're not really engaging their lats or get a neutral shoulder, so they have this rounded shoulder, they end up getting bicep tendonitis because their shoulder's rounded over, so there's no back engagement, and they're holding this really long, heavy weapon all with these tiny, small shoulder muscles. So you can run into, if it's in extreme cases, you can kind of run into some injuries like that. Because swords are levers, right? They're just a really long lever. So the longer your sword blade is, the bigger of a lever it is, which means it's easier for your opponent to use that lever effect against you. So if you ever tried, so one thing that we see in the SCA is we have people with really long swords fighting someone who's got maybe like a 36-inch sword. Like we have Grim out there, he likes to fight with sometimes smaller Messer-like swords. And if I'm fighting him with my rapier, I'm not going to try to push his sword around. He's going to win that leverage game because he's blade shorter. So it's all forte. It's all strong compared to my longer rapier, which I can hit him from further, but I can't do as much blade pushing contact kind of stuff. So that's another thing to kind of keep in mind when if you do try to make up your lack of reach with a longer weapon, is that you are creating a longer lever that you need to handle, and that's just another way your opponent might be able to exploit um, your exploit fighting you and stuff. Yeah, that was a good question.
Another question. How critical do you feel footwork to be in general and measure? I know it is critical in kendo, and it feels critical here, but I figured that I would ask.
Yeah, footwork always good, right? Like being able to move really well is never a bad thing. Like I know some fencers who are like they stand in their box, they got their like it's like they're on a D&D mat, they never leave engagement, they just stay right there, and they're just monsters, never having to move. Other people like But like if they can have good footwork, they would just be. I think they would be even that much better as fighters and stuff because you can manipulate distance, which is really important if you're fighting someone who's faster than you or or taller than you, and stuff like that. You can steal distance if you got better footwork. You can create tempo. So the tempo is opportunities where you can either gain control over your opponent's weapon or strike them. If I have really good footwork, I can make someone who's like just wait and throw that shot, think I'm in close. They throw their shot, but I'm standing still now, so now I can react to what they're doing and come on in. So yeah, the better your footwork is, the more tools that you have at your disposal. And it doesn't always need to be all blade mechanics. Sometimes you can just beat an opponent by just having really good feet. Yeah, so totally down with that.
This is a good one. Now, for those who don't know what Black Tiger style is, for those of you pure Hemaists, if you're an SEA, you know what the Black Tiger style is. But if you're not, then just think of Rob Childs, our number
Yep.
one rapier fighter currently. He is probably the creator of the Black Tiger style. So basically, a refused guard, a sword that is low, dagger high, or low. But yeah, how would you fight against someone in a low guard? In other words, a Black Tiger style. So someone who refuses uh, the blade, the vine. Now it's even worse if they're tall, like Rob Childs. So
Yeah, yeah.
let's add
He
that to the mix.
is
How do you deal with someone who's tall and refused in the Black Tiger style?
Yeah, he's got like the mix of all the things you don't want to run into in a fight. He's tall, he's very athletic, he's got quick feet, he's got quick hands, so he's got that reach advantage, he's got that speed advantage, and like he just knows his distance. Like I fought him a few times, and like he just knows exactly where when you're out of distance and what his lunge distance is. So he's an extreme case that does it very very well. But yeah, fighting someone like that blade refuse can be really tricky, especially if you like that blade contact. Like I like blade contact. That's just. Oh, did I freeze here? Oh, I'm back. Did I freeze for a few
No,
seconds?
you're good. You're good.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so like I like. For me, I struggle with people that have that blade refuse, and some of the reasons why it's hard to know exactly what their measure is, right? Because a lot of us measure our opponents if they can hit us based on where their point is. But if their point is no longer is not here, but is now further back, it's very easy to draw people in too close. So this might be a good idea for a short fencer, keeping your sword further back and maybe getting a tall fencer to step in too close, and then hitting them because you've kind of screwed up their sense of distance. But this is kind of what the Black Tigers do. They'll draw that sword back, they got if they're fighting with dagger, they have it kind of out here and looking for that big cross parry. So they're basically going to like a close guard. It's very Southern Italian, which I know they don't really, their whole thing isn't that they don't really study historical stuff, which is fine, but they kind of fall into this very Southern Italian-esque style of fencing. So if I'm fighting someone like that, I'm probably going to drop into a more Fabris pose. I'm going to withdraw my lower line targets. So instead of leaning back here like Capoferro, I'm going to lean forward, cover my head. So now my low lines are further away. My point is closer to them, so they got to deal with that. And I'm going to make sure that I have a line covered, right? I don't want to be here in the middle. If they're on the inside line, I want my blade covering that middle line. So if they throw a shot to my head, I'm safe. And I might even lower my hilt a little bit. That they try to strike me lower, there's some steel in the way. What you don't want to do is you don't want to start reaching down for their weapon, because as you can see, if I start to reach down, this is all wide open, and it's very easy when their sword is that low to disengage to the opposite line, come on up and hit. That's a mistake people move. Is they try to chase down at that weapon, um, and they can just easily disengage and hit you. So I'd say get into that forward-like posture, like that Fabris-like guard. If you have a dagger, maybe even use your dagger to try to cover the low line, or have your sword covering the low and the dagger high, so you really have that inside line covered, or outside, depending on where their sword is, and just use good footwork to try to draw them out of that stance. Get that sword extended so you can control their weapon and counterattack. But it is very difficult.
Yeah, super.
Also, good footwork. Good footwork. We're going to throw it back to the good footwork.
I've heard a million strategies on how to like fight a Black Tiger style because there's such a pain in the butt.
Yep.
Another one I've heard is like draw out their dagger because they almost never parry with their rapier, mainly parry with their dagger. So you can
Yep.
draw out their dagger and then actually go for it. But the issue is then they counter punch you with their rapier. So it's never ending.
Yeah, you gotta get ready to parry and riposte at the same time. You gotta because if you try to do it in Dewey Tempe, especially against Rob, he's gonna be recovered by the time you throw your riposte, or he's gonna throw over double or renewed attack and and hit you with a secondary shot and stuff. So you need to be good at those single tempo attacks and defensive attacks.
So let's see here. Yeah, I think that's it for questions. Does anybody have anything else? Maybe any. My friend says you can spring the trap first and don't let them regroup.
Yeah, it's not a bad one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, again, it's all about like getting them out of their comfort zone, which is that guard, into a spot where like maybe you have an advantage because you're more comfortable there. Which is always easier said than done. Like none of the stuff that we've gone over today is necessarily easy. It's just like sure, it's simple, but it's not easy, and that's where like the grinding of the XP of drills and practice and fencing games really uh, come show their worth and come into play.
All right, so I have a new fencer from my school that has a question. What is your favorite advice for new fencers?
Oh man, uh, so I think the big one is have patience with yourself. Like the first step to being good is sucking, and like I know a lot of us are probably perfectionists. I'm sure I'm not the only one here that gets very frustrated when they don't master something in the first 10 minutes, right? So like you got to have patience and realize that like 10 years of fighting, you'll be good, but you'll still think that like you're not amazing and there's always more to learn and stuff like that. So just have patience with yourself, be forgiving of yourself. You're going to have good and bad days as you go forward. Be inquisitive, have an open mind, try to learn from as many different people as you can, especially if they teach the system that you're learning and that you enjoy. So if you're big into Destreza, try to find other Destreza coaches out there and see how they approach it. Because I feel like, especially with Destreza, I've run into like, if I find 5 different Destreza fencers, they all have a different approach to it. So I think there's a lot to glean from that, especially in that particular school. But like, I'll use some Destreza like stuff in my Italian. I'll do like what you guys would call like the movement of conclusion. I'll throw that shit in with my Italian because it works. We see that pops up in the like in Charles Besnard, who's a French fencing master. He does those kind of like caning, yielding parries into cuts or disarms and stuff. So you might find some cool ways of mixing and matching systems because swords are swords and stuff like that. And work on your footwork. Footwork.
So I have a question from an instructor. I have a student who is a sport fencer during practice. What should I emphasize in teaching them?
Yeah, so I think it kind of goes back to the slide. The first thing is making sure that they know how to control their opponent's weapon, because they're not going to be able to strike a taller opponent if they don't have control over the weapon, unless their taller fencer is just really that the bestial man, as Capoferro would call it, right? They're just not fencing with good technique. So make sure they know how to control the lines of attack, good blade opposition, all that kind of stuff. Make sure they know when they've stepped into their opponent's measure and how much further they need to go into their own measure, right? Because that's a huge difference. They're going to have to weather maybe a shot or two from their taller opponent before they can get into a spot where they can throw their own attacks. So basically, just making sure uh, they know how to control the weapon, they know what the distance and measure is like, and they know how when they get advantage over their opponent's weapon, how they can press that advantage.
Okay, I have another question. What's one technique should more people be working on adding to their game or perfecting? I'd like to
Ooh,
throw in my opinion on it. It's footwork. I think footwork.
yeah, go for
it. But I mean, I'd like to hear what you say too. But
it. Oh man, I'll let you go first. I think I need a second, and since you have an answer already, I'll have you go.
my answer is just footwork. I mean, if it's
Yeah.
in technique, like the one main thing. I mean, if it's a blade technique, then that's different. But if it's one thing out of fencing, that is, most important in perfecting, in my opinion, is footwork, because you can use it to create measure, to create tempo, right? So that's almost majority of the game. So
Nice. I would say also disengages.
yeah,
I feel like some people like it's so easy to do, but that we don't practice it very long, and end up we end up especially if we get tired, our disengages get huge, right? There's just these giant hula hoops or these giant U's versus something that's like a very small U or a tight V, depending on what master you're reading and what shape you want to make. So I think always like some disengages, because if you have a tight disengage, you'll appear faster than you actually are because your blade is just moving in smaller motions. So you'll be faster, and your opponent will have harder time perceiving what you're doing that way too. And that always plays really well if your footwork's good too. If you got good blade work and good footwork, that's like 75% of fencing right there.
hey, what master is favorite, and who do you find most interesting? So, what master is your favorite, I assume,
Oh
and who do
man,
you find?
I don't know if I have a favorite. Like I know that people think of me as the Alfieri guy because I'll do like a bunch of A and S for that. It's just because not a lot of people read Alfieri.
I
So
thought
like
you meant.
yeah, well, yeah. Here's the thing, like everyone reads Fabris, the Capoferro, Giganti because we've had those translations forever. But Alfieri is kind of like he's very similar to Capoferro and Giganti, so like there's not a ton that's new there really beyond like the plates have clothes on, which is kind of new and different. You get to see the fashions of the time. But I like reading him because he is a little bit different in that regard. And I really like his theory section. His theory section's like Fabris, that it's very easy to understand, and you could just read the theory section if you've been fencing for a while, and not really necessarily have to deal with the plates at all, and still get a lot out of it. So I love his theory section. I'm really excited for a translation of Charles Besnard to come out. There's only been so he's 1650s French fencing master, kind of in this transition period between the rapier and the small sword, which is really interesting. There's only a half translation out, but the full translation should be coming out in the next year or so, based on what I hear. So I'm very excited about that. Partly because of how he sets up his book. He has it like when you get to like the practical section, he's like, all right, here's all the different you've engaged your opponent on the inside line. Here's everything they could possibly do, and here's all your possible options based on what they do. So you almost get like a flow chart, a written out flow chart of how to defeat opponents based on what they do. And I'm really excited to kind of like read a book that's written that way, and try to like maybe create some lesson plans and drills based off of that. So that's the one I'm super excited for.
Sounds amazing. Do you have now? Patrick is a Destreza fencer, so I'm assuming his question is: do you have any manuals translations you recommend? I guess to start off with Italian. I think that's
Yeah,
first.
for Italian, so like Giganti is probably the easiest to jump into. He doesn't have a much theory section, but his practical section is pretty easy to understand. So he's kind of like people joke that he's like Italian 101, and I think it's a pretty good way to start with. Capoferro is a little bit more difficult. His theory section can be really difficult to understand, but his plates are really nice and the plays are kind of good. And then you got Fabris, which is just like that's the master thesis of Italian rapier. Like his theory section is fantastic. He's got so many plates, so you can get so many different iterations of how you can use different techniques and stuff. So
Well, I think
depending
you have
on
the coolest guards.
yeah, I love that guard. Yeah, that leaned over Secunda guard. Like I've gotten a lot of mileage the past year out of that, especially as a short fencer, because now I'm like small and yeah, it's great. So yeah, I would probably say like
This was our height or shorter.
yeah, maybe. I kind of wonder. Yeah, so that's how I would put it, like kind of in that order ish for the Italians. But you don't need to go in that order. You could jump. Some of my new fencer students jump right into Fabris because like he's just that easy to understand. And he just explains things that well. So, but it is very thick, so you're diving into kind of the deep end.
I think that's pretty much all the questions. Last call for questions. I think this has been amazing, and thankfully I do have this on record. So, a lot of folks at my school who also have trouble with our 6'9" student is gonna love watching this over. Thank you so much for being here, and let's just double check the chat to see. Yep. So thank you so much again on behalf of Terra Nova School of Swords and the Maritime Sword Schools. Thank you, Justin, so much for this. Now, next up, we have Andre from Montreal. His title is going to be Rapier and Tournaments, Training, Tricks, and Other Things You Should Not Know. So he's going to be giving us some secrets. All the beans will be spilled. Andre has been pretty much fencing Spain, Canada, possibly the U.S. as well. So he's been competing more places than I have for sure. So he's got tons of advice. So it's something you definitely don't want to miss next week. And China. Oh, apparently and China. Okay. So the motherland. Okay. All right. So I hope you guys join us. It'll be on Monday. So it won't be on Unusual Thursday. Just because all my Destreza students usually goes to class on Monday. So this would be a great talk for them. And so we're having it during my Destreza class. Destreza with Andre. After that, it'll be Kieran Rowe from Ontario. I do not know what he's going to talk about yet. He's going to let me know soon. But that's going to be on Thursday, next Thursday, same time, okay? So thank you, everybody, for coming here and being a part of this discussion and lecture. Thank you again, Justin.
Thanks, man.
All right. Have a good night, everybody. Stay safe out there.
Night, dude.